Thanks for coming back for this hour on this Friday. I'm Colin Mayfield.
And I'm Vanessa Rufus. In less than an hour, South Carolina is set to carry out a rare firing squad execution. Death row inmate Brad Sigmund was convicted in 2001 for the murders of his ex-girlfriend's parents in Greenville.
Sigmund specifically chose the firing squad method over other available options, citing concerns about lethal injection.
On March 7, 2025, Brad Keith Sigmund was led into the death chamber at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. He was 67 years old, making him the oldest person ever executed in South Carolina. 3 officers stood behind a wall with rifles aimed at his heart through a rectangular opening. At 6:05 in the evening, they fired simultaneously. 3 minutes later, Brad was pronounced dead, the first person executed by firing squad in the United States in 15 years. Brad faced execution for the brutal murders of David and Gladys Lark, killed on the morning of April 27, 2001, in their home in Taylors, South Carolina. David, 62, and Gladys, 59, were beaten to death with a baseball bat, 9 crushing blows to each of their skulls, by their daughter's ex-boyfriend. They lived for 3 to 5 minutes after the attack ended, drowning in their own blood. Brad then kidnapped their daughter Rebecca at gunpoint, shot her when she escaped, and fled. He was captured 11 days later in Tennessee. He confessed immediately, admitted his guilt at trial, and never denied what he had done. Brad's execution would make him South Carolina's first firing squad execution in modern history, and only the 4th such execution in the United States since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976. He chose the firing squad not because he wanted to die that way, but because he feared the electric chair would burn him alive, and because 3 recent lethal injections in South Carolina had gone badly wrong, with inmates potentially drowning in their own lung fluid. But before we examine that final day, there is a story that needs to be told. A story about a boy born into violence and chaos, about systems that failed to treat his mental illness or address his addiction, about a man whose fractured mind snapped under the pressure of rejection, and about a horrific crime that destroyed multiple families and left questions that remain unanswered even after the execution was carried out. This is the story of Brad Keith Sigmund, David and Gladys Lark, and the 24-year journey from murder to execution that asks us to confront what justice truly means. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Brad Keith Sigmund entered the world on November 12, 1957, in South Carolina. His mother, Virginia, was just 17 years old when she gave birth to him. Within the next few years, she would have 4 more children, each born within a year of the other. The rapid succession of births left Virginia overwhelmed and struggling. Brad's father, Ronnie Sigmund, served in the United States military. The job required frequent relocations, and the family moved constantly. They lived in Taylors, South Carolina, then Greer, and eventually even spent time in the Philippines after the youngest child was born. For young Brad, stability was a foreign concept. But the constant moving was not the worst part of his childhood. Ronnie Sigmund was an alcoholic. When he drank, he became violent. Virginia bore the brunt of his rage, and Brad, as the oldest child, often witnessed these attacks. He tried to protect his mother, stepping between his parents when his father's fists began to fly. For this, Ronnie targeted Brad specifically. While the 4 younger children were spared physical abuse, Brad was not. The violence at home shaped Brad in ways that would echo through his entire life. He developed what would later be identified as organic brain damage from the trauma. His childhood was marked by fear, uncertainty, and pain. Despite the chaos, Brad took on responsibilities far beyond his years. When one of his younger brothers was injured and struggled to walk, 13-year-old Brad carried him everywhere on his back. When the family lacked food, 16-year-old Brad started working factory shifts to buy groceries for his siblings. He shielded them from the worst of their circumstances with jokes and small acts of tenderness. Brad's parents eventually divorced when he was still young. Virginia struggled as a single mother, trying to adapt to life without the structure of military bases. The instability continued. Brad attended school sporadically, never finding solid ground. In 1977, just 9 weeks before he was scheduled to graduate high school, Brad dropped out. He was 19 years old and had met a woman he wanted to marry. The young couple moved from upstate South Carolina to Manning, a small town where they hoped to start fresh. They soon had a son named Robbie. For a time, things seemed to stabilize. Brad worked and tried to provide for his family. He was also a loving father who played with his son and taught him to work. One year, Brad skipped paying his insurance bill so he could afford to buy Robbie a dirt bike for his birthday. It was the happiest birthday Robbie ever had. But Brad's marriage was not as stable as these moments of fatherly love suggested. Brad's relationship with his wife began to deteriorate. The stress of providing for a family, combined with his undiagnosed mental health issues, created tension in the home. Brad began drinking more heavily. Arguments became more frequent. His wife grew concerned about his behavior and his substance use. The marriage that had begun with hope was fracturing. By the late 1980s, Brad and his wife were living increasingly separate lives under the same roof. She began to pull away, creating emotional distance. Brad, whose childhood had taught him that abandonment was always just around the corner, felt the familiar panic rising. His wife eventually asked for separation. The details of their split remain private, but by 1990 they were no longer living together as husband and wife. Brad's world was crumbling once again, and he did not have the tools to cope with the loss in healthy ways. On November 17, 1990, Brad Sigmund made a decision that would reveal just how far his mental state had deteriorated. His marriage had collapsed, and his wife had made it clear she wanted nothing more to do with him. But Brad, desperate and unstable, could not accept that reality. He went to her home in Manning, South Carolina, the home they had once shared, the home where he had raised his son, Robbie. What exactly Brad hoped to accomplish that night remains unclear. Perhaps he wanted to talk to her, to convince her to give him another chance. Whatever his intentions, the moment he broke through that door, he crossed a line from which there would be no return. The domestic dispute escalated quickly. Voices were raised, emotions ran high. And then came the gunfire. Brad was shot several times in the stomach. The bullets tore through his abdomen, causing massive internal damage. He collapsed, bleeding profusely, his life hanging by a thread. But the worst injury that night was not Brad's own. During the chaos of the confrontation, a stray bullet struck 12-year-old Robbie in the arm. The boy Brad had carried on his back when he was injured as a child, the son he had bought a dirt bike for, the child he loved. Robbie was now wounded because of Brad's actions. Emergency responders rushed both Brad and Robbie to Clarendon County Hospital. Robbie's injury, while painful, was not life-threatening. The bullet had passed through his arm without hitting bone or major blood vessels. He would recover physically, though the psychological damage of that night would stay with him forever. Brad's injuries were far more serious. The gunshot wounds to his stomach required immediate surgery. The doctors stabilized him at Clarendon County Hospital before transferring him to Richland County Medical Center, where surgeons worked to repair the damage to his internal organs. Blood transfusions, hours of surgery. The touch-and-go uncertainty of whether he would survive. Brad did survive. After approximately a week of hospitalization and recovery, he was released. He left the hospital with surgical scars across his abdomen and the knowledge that he had traumatized his own child. Brad moved on from Manning after his recovery. He returned to Greenville County in the 1990s, eventually settling in the city of Greenville itself. Brad drifted through the mid to late 1990s without direction or purpose. He moved from job to job, apartment to apartment, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. He drank heavily and used drugs, cocaine, crack, whatever he could get his hands on, to cope with the depression and self-loathing that consumed him. He was isolated and lonely. The family connections that had once provided some stability were fraying. His younger siblings were building their own lives. His mother was dealing with her own issues. His father, who had caused so much of Brad's childhood trauma, remained a distant figure. In 1998, Brad met a woman named Rebecca Barber. She was a single mother with 3 children from previous relationships, living in Greenville and working to provide for her family. For Brad, who had experienced so little stability in his life, Rebecca represented hope. A chance to build something lasting, to create the family he had never truly had. They became close friends first. For 5 years, they built a friendship based on trust and mutual support. Brad was good with Rebecca's children. He worked and helped provide for the household. Rebecca later said those years of friendship were important. They really knew each other before the romance began. Eventually, their friendship turned romantic. Brad and Rebecca became a couple and moved in together in a trailer in Taylors, a suburb of Greenville. The trailer sat on property owned by Rebecca's parents, David and Gladys Lark, who lived in another trailer right next door at 948 East Darby Road. For about 3 years, Brad and Rebecca built a life together. Brad worked and tried to provide. He formed a bond with Rebecca's children. He had Sunday dinners with the Larks and became part of their extended family. For the first time since his marriage had fallen apart, Brad seemed to have found something resembling peace and stability. But Brad's demons had not disappeared. He had anger issues that occasionally surfaced in troubling ways. Rebecca later recalled that Brad had slapped her once during their relationship. It was a warning sign she did not fully recognize at the time, or perhaps chose to overlook because of all the good she saw in him. More concerning was Brad's attachment style. His childhood had taught him that stability could vanish at any moment. Everything good in his life had always been temporary, always ended in loss and pain. This time, he told himself, things would be different. He would hold on to Rebecca no matter what. He could not, would not let her leave him. But early in 2001, Rebecca made a decision that would set everything in motion. She told Brad she wanted to end their relationship. She asked him to leave the trailer. Brad refused to accept it. He begged her to reconsider, calling her repeatedly and pleading for another chance. Rebecca stood firm. She packed her things and moved next door into a parent's trailer. David Lark served Brad with eviction papers. He had 2 weeks to vacate the property. Brad's world was collapsing again, and this time his fractured mind could not handle it. David and Gladys Lark had no idea that by welcoming their daughter back into their home and serving eviction papers to her ex-boyfriend, they had set in motion events that would be a disaster. They were simply being good parents, doing what good parents do, protecting their child from an unhealthy relationship, and offering her a safe place to rebuild her life. They had been good parents for more than 4 decades. David and Gladys had built the kind of life that many people dream of, but few achieve. They were simple country folks who found their happiness not in material wealth, but in family, faith, and hard work. After Rebecca moved out, Brad Sigmund remained in the trailer on the Larks' property. He was supposed to leave within 2 weeks, as the eviction papers stated, but he could not bring himself to go. Every day he watched Rebecca's movements. He saw her come and go, taking her children to school, running errands, living her life without him. The rejection consumed Brad. His mind, already fragile from untreated bipolar disorder and childhood trauma, fixated on a single thought. Rebecca had left him, and he could not accept it. He convinced himself that she must be seeing another man. There was no evidence of this, but Brad's paranoia grew stronger each day. He began stalking Rebecca. He would follow her in his car, watching from a distance to see where she went and who she talked to. He called her constantly, begging her to come back to him. Each time she refused, his desperation deepened. He told her he loved her more than anything in the world. He pleaded with her to give him another chance. Rebecca stood firm. The relationship was over. The obsession began to dominate every aspect of Brad's life. He stopped taking care of himself. He drank more heavily and used drugs more frequently. His drug of choice was crack cocaine, which he combined with alcohol. The substances amplified his already unstable mental state, feeding his paranoia and rage. Friends and acquaintances noticed the change in Brad. He talked about Rebecca constantly. His conversations became repetitive and disturbing. He would rant about how she had wronged him, how she owed him another chance, how he would do anything to get her back. Some people tried to reason with him, but Brad was beyond reasoning. At work, Brad's performance suffered. He could not focus on his tasks. His mind was always elsewhere, circling back to Rebecca and the life he felt had been stolen from him. He knew his time on the property was limited. Soon he would have to leave, and then he would lose even the ability to watch Rebecca from a distance. The thought of losing that last connection terrified him. It felt like he was being erased from Rebecca's life, as if their 3 years together meant nothing. He could not let that happen. He would not let that happen. Brad's mental state continued to deteriorate throughout April 2001. On the evening of April 26, 2001, Brad invited his friend Eugene Strube to the trailer. Strube agreed to come over, and the two men spent the night drinking and smoking crack cocaine. As the night wore on and the drugs took hold, Brad's obsession with Rebecca spilled out. He ranted about how Rebecca had left him. He talked about how unfair it was. He said he needed to do something to get her back. Strube listened, assuming this was just drug-fueled talk. Brad had complained about Rebecca before. Strube did not think anything would come of it. But as the night progressed, Brad's talk became more specific. He told Strube about a plan forming in his mind. When Rebecca left the next morning to take her children to school, Brad would go next door to the Larks' home. He would tie up David and Gladys so they could not call the police. Then, when Rebecca returned, he would force her to come with him. They would disappear together, and he would make her understand that they belonged together. Strube did not take the plan seriously. Brad said things like this when he was high. In the morning, Strube assumed Brad would sober up and realize how crazy it all sounded. Strube eventually fell asleep on the couch. But Brad did not sleep much that night. His mind raced with thoughts of Rebecca. The plan he had described to Strube felt more real with each passing hour. The morning of April 27, 2001 began like any other in the Larker household. David woke early, as he always did. At 62 years old, he was still working first shift at the factory and maintained the discipline of a lifetime of early mornings. Gladys, 59, worked second shift and typically slept in a bit later. But this morning, both of them were up and moving around their home on East Derby Road. Rebecca had spent the night at her parents' house with her 3 children. The kids needed to get ready for school, and Rebecca went through the familiar morning routine. She helped them get dressed, made sure they had everything they needed, and prepared to drive them to school. David and Gladys knew this schedule well. After Rebecca left with the children, they would have the house to themselves for a while. In the trailer next door, Brad Sigmund woke from his restless night. He had barely slept. His mind was still racing from the drugs and alcohol he had consumed with Eugene Strube the night before. Strube was still asleep on the couch, exhausted from the long night. Brad looked out the window and saw Rebecca loading her children into the car. His heart pounded. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The plan he had discussed with Strube was no longer just talk. It was going to happen. He watched as Rebecca's car pulled out of the driveway and headed toward the school. She would be gone for at least 30 minutes, maybe longer. That gave him time to do what needed to be done. Brad woke Strube and told him it was time to go. They both left the trailer and stood outside. Strube had sobered up some during the night and was starting to reconsider. The plan that had seemed almost abstract in the haze of drugs now felt real and dangerous. Strube told Brad he did not want to be part of this. He turned and walked away, leaving Brad alone. Brad did not try to stop him. He did not need Strube's help. He knew what he had to do. Brad walked around to the underside of his trailer and retrieved a baseball bat he kept stored there. The bat was wooden and solid. He tested its weight in his hands. Then he walked the short distance to the Larks' home. He did not knock. He opened the door and walked inside. David Lark was in the kitchen. He looked up and saw Brad standing there with the baseball bat. In that instant, David understood that something was terribly wrong. He called out to Gladys to bring him his gun. It was an instinct born of decades of protecting his family. But Brad moved faster. Before David could react further, Brad swung the bat with full force. The impact struck David in the back of the head. The sound was sickening, a dull crack that echoed through the small home. David's body jerked from the blow, and he staggered. Brad did not stop. He swung again, and again, and again. Gladys heard the commotion from the living room. She came running to see what was happening and saw her husband being attacked. She screamed and turned to flee, trying to reach the safety of another room or perhaps to get David's gun herself. Brad chased her into the living room. Gladys put her arms up instinctively, trying to protect her head from the blows she knew were coming. Brad swung the bat at her. The first blow landed on her forearm, fracturing the bone. She cried out in pain but kept trying to shield herself. Brad swung again, and this time the bat struck her head. The force of the impact was tremendous. Gladys fell, but she was not dead. She was still moving, still breathing, still conscious of the horror unfolding around her. Brad turned and went back to the kitchen. David was still alive, still moving despite the catastrophic injuries to his skull. Brad could not allow him to get up. He swung the bat down on David's head repeatedly. David's skull was shattered. The damage was catastrophic. Blood poured from his wounds. His breathing became labored as blood filled his sinuses and airways. He was drowning in his own blood. Brad returned to the living room to check on Gladys. She was still moving. He could not have her calling for help or trying to escape. He struck her again, 9 times in total, matching the number of blows he had delivered to David. Her skull fractured and collapsed under the assault. Like her husband, she began breathing in blood as her sinuses filled. The attack took less than 2 minutes from start to finish. In that short span of time, Brad Sigmund had destroyed 2 lives and shattered a family. Brad Sigmund stood in the home and watched them die. He made no effort to help them or call for medical assistance. He felt no remorse in that moment. His mind, fractured by mental illness and drugs, processed the scene with detachment. This was necessary, he told himself. This was what he had to do to get Rebecca back. When he was certain both David and Gladys were no longer moving, Brad searched the house. He found David's gun, a handgun that David kept for protection. Brad took it. He would need it for the next phase of his plan. Then Brad sat down in a chair and waited. The bodies of David and Gladys Lark lay cooling in the small home, while Brad stared at the door, waiting for Rebecca to return from dropping her children at school. The scene was grotesque. Blood covered the floors in both the kitchen and living room. The baseball bat, now stained with blood and tissue, lay where Brad had dropped it. The Larks' home, which had been a place of love and family gatherings just hours before, had become a crime scene of unspeakable violence. Brad's mind was calm as he waited. The manic episode that had driven him to this point was still in full force. He believed he was in control of the situation. He believed his plan would work. He would take Rebecca, and they would leave together. He would explain everything to her. She would understand. She would forgive him. They would be together again. Time passed slowly. Brad waited, listening for the sound of Rebecca's car returning. After what felt like an eternity, Brad heard a car pull into the driveway. He stood up and moved to where he could see out the window. It was Rebecca. She had returned from the school and was walking toward her parents' home. Brad gripped David's gun and moved to position himself near the door. Rebecca Barber stepped through the door of her parents' home, expecting to find them having coffee or watching television. Instead, she found Brad Sigmund standing in her living room with a gun pointed at her. Her mind could not immediately process what she was seeing. Why was Brad here? Why did he have a gun? Where were her parents? The questions came rapid fire, but she had no time to voice them. Brad did not give her a chance to scream. He grabbed her roughly and forced her toward the door. Rebecca resisted, trying to pull away, trying to call out for her mother and father. But Brad's grip was iron tight, and the gun pressed against her was a clear threat. He told her to be quiet, to come with him, to not make this harder than it needed to be. Rebecca's eyes frantically scanned the rooms as Brad dragged her through the house. She saw blood, so much blood. Her heart stopped. In the kitchen, she glimpsed her father lying motionless on the floor in a pool of red. In the living room, her mother was visible in her peripheral vision, also unmoving, also surrounded by blood. The realization hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her parents were dead. Brad had killed them. The man she had lived with for 3 years, the man she had trusted and cared for, had murdered her mother and father. Terror flooded her system. If Brad had done this to her parents, what would he do to her? Her children were safe at school, but she was alone with a killer. She needed to survive. She needed to get away and get help. Brad forced Rebecca out of the house and toward her 2001 Honda Passport that sat in the driveway. He kept the gun trained on her as he shoved her into the driver's seat. He climbed into the passenger seat, gun still pointed at her body, and ordered her to drive. Rebecca's hands shook as she started the engine. Her mind raced. She thought about her children. She thought about her parents' bodies lying in that house. She thought about the fact that she was now at the mercy of someone who had just committed an act of unthinkable violence. Brad told her his plan as they drove. They were going to leave South Carolina. They were going to North Carolina. They would be together again, just like before. He would make her see that they belonged together. He spoke with conviction, as if the murder of her parents was a minor obstacle they could overcome. Rebecca said nothing. She focused on the road and looked for an opportunity to escape. She knew she could not overpower Brad while he had the gun. She needed to be smart. She needed to wait for the right moment. Brad talked continuously as Rebecca drove. He explained why he had done what he did. He said he loved her more than anything in the world. He said he could not live without her. He said her parents had tried to keep them apart, and he could not allow that. He seemed to expect Rebecca to understand, to perhaps even sympathize with his reasoning. Rebecca kept her eyes on the road. She nodded when Brad seemed to expect a response, but she did not speak. Her mind was working furiously, calculating distances and speeds and chances of survival. They had been driving for several minutes when Rebecca saw her opportunity. The car was traveling at a decent speed, but not so fast that jumping out would be instantly fatal. They were approaching a section of road with some visibility. If she could get out of the car and run, maybe someone would see her. Maybe she could reach help before Brad caught her. She did not allow herself to overthink it. If she hesitated, she would lose her nerve. Rebecca opened the driver's side door and threw herself from the moving vehicle. The impact with the ground was brutal. Rebecca hit hard and rolled. Pain shot through her body as she tumbled across the pavement, but she forced herself to get up. Ignoring the pain, she ran as fast as her injured body would allow. Behind her, she heard Brad shouting. The car screeched to a halt. She heard a car door slam. She heard footsteps pounding behind her. She did not look back. She just ran. Then she heard the gunshot. The bullet struck Rebecca in the foot. The pain was excruciating, and her leg buckled. She stumbled but did not fall. She kept running, limping now, desperately trying to put distance between herself and Brad. Brad chased her, still firing. The gun clicked empty. Brad had run out of ammunition. Rebecca kept running. She saw houses ahead. She screamed for help. She pounded on doors. Someone finally responded, calling 911 while pulling Rebecca inside to safety. Brad stood in the road, watching Rebecca disappear into a stranger's home. His plan had fallen apart. Rebecca had escaped. The police would be coming. He turned and ran back to the Honda Passport, climbed in, and drove away from the scene as fast as he could. The 911 call came in at approximately 9 in the morning on April 27, 2001. A frantic caller reported that a woman had been shot and was seeking refuge in their home. She was bleeding from her foot, and screaming about her parents being dead. The dispatcher immediately sent police and ambulance units to the location. Officers arrived within minutes. Rebecca Barber was hysterical, but coherent enough to give them the critical information. Her ex-boyfriend, Brad Sigmund, had killed her parents, David and Gladys Lark, at their home on East Derby Road in Taylors. He had kidnapped her at gunpoint and shot her when she escaped from the moving vehicle. He was driving her Honda Passport and was armed. Police units were dispatched to the Lark residence, while paramedics attended to Rebecca's gunshot wound. The bullet had gone through her foot, causing significant damage but not life-threatening injury. Rebecca was transported to Greenville Memorial Hospital for treatment. At the Lark home, officers entered cautiously, unsure if Brad Sigmund might still be inside. They called out, identifying themselves as police. There was no response. They moved through the small trailer, weapons drawn, clearing each room. They found David Lark first, lying on the kitchen floor in a massive pool of blood. The extent of his head injuries made it immediately clear he was deceased. In the living room, they found Gladys Lark in a similar condition. She too had sustained catastrophic head trauma and had no pulse. The scene was horrific. Blood spattered the walls and furniture. The baseball bat, covered in blood and tissue, lay on the floor. It was obvious this had been a brutal and sustained attack. Officers secured the scene and called for homicide detectives and the medical examiner. Detectives began processing the crime scene while other units searched for Brad Sigmund and the stolen Honda Passport. An broadcast was issued with Sigmund's description and the vehicle information. He was considered armed and extremely dangerous. Investigators interviewed Eugene Strube, who had been with Brad the night before the murders. Strube described how Brad had spent the evening drinking and using crack cocaine while ranting about Rebecca. He recounted Brad's plan to tie up the Larks and kidnap Rebecca. Strube admitted he had not taken the threat seriously, assuming they were drug-fueled talk that would not amount to anything. Strube's testimony was crucial. It established premeditation. Brad had not acted on impulse. He had planned the attack the night before and then carried it out the next morning. This would become important when prosecutors sought the death penalty. Detectives also spoke with Brad's mother, Virginia Wooten. She was devastated by the news, but agreed to cooperate with police. She had not seen Brad recently, but knew he was struggling with the breakup from Rebecca. She provided information about Brad's mental state and history. Police placed a wiretap on Virginia's phone in case Brad tried to contact her. It was a common tactic. Fugitives often reached out to family members, and investigators hoped Brad would make that mistake. Meanwhile, the search for Brad expanded. Police checked his known associates and previous addresses. They contacted law enforcement agencies in neighboring states, particularly North Carolina, since Brad had told Rebecca that was where they were going. Investigators examined Brad's trailer on the Larks' property. They found evidence of drug use and documentation related to the eviction proceedings. They also found personal items belonging to Rebecca, suggesting Brad had not accepted that the relationship was over. The manhunt intensified over the following days. Brad's face appeared on local news broadcasts. Tips came in from the public, but none led to his immediate capture. Brad had seemingly vanished. Investigators knew they were looking for a desperate man who had nothing left to lose. He had murdered 2 people and attempted to kill a third. He was likely still using drugs and alcohol. He was dangerous and unpredictable. Days turned into a week. The Lark family held a funeral for David and Gladys. The community mourned the loss of 2 well-loved people. Rebecca struggled with physical injuries and psychological trauma while trying to care for her 3 children. Then, on the 11th day of the manhunt, police got the break they needed. Quick reminder, if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Now let's continue. After fleeing the scene where Rebecca escaped, he abandoned the Honda Passport and stole a recreational vehicle. The RV gave him mobility and a place to sleep. He drove aimlessly, staying away from major highways and populated areas as much as possible. His destination was Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a tourist town nestled in the Smoky Mountains. The area was popular with campers and outdoor enthusiasts. Brad found a campground and parked the stolen RV. He kept to himself, avoiding contact with other campers. He was surviving on the supplies in the RV and whatever he could purchase with the cash he had taken from the Lark home. But Brad was falling apart. The drugs he had used before the murders were wearing off, and withdrawal made him sick and irritable. He had no access to more crack cocaine, and the alcohol he consumed did little to quiet his mind. The reality of what he had done was beginning to penetrate his consciousness. In lucid moments, Brad thought about his family. He thought about his mother, his siblings, his son Robbie. He knew they would be ashamed of what he had done. He knew he had destroyed his own life along with the Larks' lives. The isolation of being on the run was crushing. Brad had no one to talk to, no one to help him make sense of his fractured thoughts. He was alone with his guilt and his fear. On his 11th day as a fugitive, Brad made a critical mistake. He called his mother. Virginia Wooten answered the phone and immediately recognized her son's voice. The wiretap police had placed on her line began recording. Virginia kept Brad on the phone, following the instructions police had given her for this exact scenario. She told Brad she loved him. She urged him to surrender. She said the police were looking for him and that he needed to turn himself in before someone got hurt. Brad was emotional on the call. He expressed remorse for what he had done. He told his mother he did not want to live, that he had done an awful thing. Virginia told Brad that both she and he would give their lives to bring the Larks back if they could, but that was not possible. The only thing Brad could do now was face the consequences of his actions. She begged him to tell her where he was. Brad hesitated. He knew that telling his mother his location meant the police would come for him. But he was tired of running. He was tired of being alone. A part of him wanted this to be over. He told his mother he was at a campground in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. He described the location and the RV he was staying in. Virginia relayed this information to police, even as she continued talking to Brad, keeping him on the line. Law enforcement in Tennessee was immediately notified. Officers from multiple agencies converged on the campground. They approached carefully, unsure if Brad would resist arrest or attempt suicide by cop. They surrounded the RV and called for Brad to come out with his hands visible. Brad did not resist. He opened the door of the RV and walked out with his hands raised. Officers moved in quickly, handcuffing him and searching him for weapons. Brad was taken into custody without incident. He was processed at the local police station in Tennessee, then extradited back to South Carolina to face charges. During transport, Brad was quiet. He did not ask about Rebecca or her condition. He did not ask about his family. He stared out the window and said nothing. Back in South Carolina, the news of Brad's capture brought relief to the Lark family and the community. Rebecca learned that her attacker was in custody and would face justice. She could begin to focus on healing, though the emotional scars would take far longer to address than her physical injuries. Brad was booked into the Greenville County Detention Center. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, first-degree burglary, kidnapping, assault and battery with intent to kill, possession of a firearm during commission of a violent crime, and grand larceny. Prosecutors immediately announced their intention to seek the death penalty. The brutality of the murders, the fact that 2 people had been killed, and the additional crimes of kidnapping and assault made this a clear capital case in their view. Brad was assigned public defenders John Abdallah and Frank Epes. Neither attorney had experience with death penalty cases. When detectives interviewed Brad, he confessed fully to the crimes. He admitted planning the attack the night before. He admitted killing David and Gladys Lark with the baseball bat. He admitted kidnapping Rebecca with the intent to kill her and then himself. He spoke clearly and showed understanding of what he had done. His confession was typed up by a detective and signed by Brad. In it, he stated his intention clearly. If I couldn't have her, I wasn't going to let anybody else have her. And I knew it got to the point where I couldn't have her. My intention was to kill her and then myself. That was my intention all along. With Brad in custody and a full confession obtained, prosecutors prepared for trial. The trial of Brad Sigmund began in July 2002 at the Greenville County Courthouse, just over a year after the murders of David and Gladys Lark. Prosecutor Bob Ariel led the state's case, charging Brad with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of first-degree burglary. The courtroom was packed with family members, media, and community members seeking justice. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented Brad's full confession, testimony from Eugene Struber about the premeditation, Rebecca's account of the kidnapping and shooting, forensic evidence from the crime scene, and the murder weapon itself. Brad's defense attorneys, John Abdallah and Frank Epps, made a strategic decision not to contest his guilt. Brad himself wanted to be honest about his actions and instructed his lawyers not to present a defense during the guilt phase. When the trial began, Brad stood before the jury and stated simply that he was guilty, had no excuse, and was sorry. The medical examiner provided graphic testimony about the victims' injuries. Both David and Gladys had sustained 9 separate blows to the head, with tremendous force that shattered their skulls. They had defensive wounds showing they tried to protect themselves, and they lived for 3 to 5 minutes after the attack ended, drowning in their own blood. The testimony was disturbing, causing visible distress among jurors and family members in the gallery. Eugene Struber testified about the night before the murders, when Brad laid out his plan while they used drugs together. Rebecca Barbar took the stand for the first time since that terrible morning and described finding Brad in her parents' home with a gun, being forced into the car, jumping from the moving vehicle, and being shot in the foot as she fled. Crime scene investigators presented photographs showing the blood-soaked rooms and the brutality of the attack. The prosecution's case took less than 2 days, and the jury quickly returned a guilty verdict on all charges. The trial then moved to the sentencing phase, where the real battle would take place. Prosecutor Ariel argued that Brad deserved the death penalty based on 3 aggravating factors. First, he had murdered 2 people during one course of conduct. Second, the murders occurred during the commission of a burglary, when Brad entered the Larks' home without permission and with intent to commit violence. Third, and most damning, the murders were committed with physical torture, since both victims were struck repeatedly while conscious and then lived for several minutes drowning in their own blood. Ariel emphasized the premeditated nature of the crimes and the lack of mercy Brad showed his victims. He presented photographs of the crime scene and called members of the Lark family to testify about their devastating loss. Darrell Lark wept as he described how his parents had shaped him and taught him about life. Family members explained how the murders had destroyed their sense of security and their tradition of gathering together. Ariel concluded by asking why the jury should show mercy to Brad when he showed none to David and Gladys Lark. The defense attorneys faced an enormous challenge. Their strategy focused on mitigation, attempting to humanize Brad and help the jury understand the forces that had shaped him. They called Brad's son Robbie, who testified about happy memories with his father, including the birthday when Brad bought him a dirt bike after skipping the insurance payment. Brad's father Ronnie testified that Brad had always been the peacemaker in the family, which made the violence so shocking. Brad's mother Virginia described his immediate remorse after the murders. 5 employees from the detention center testified that Brad had been cooperative and remorseful since his arrest, adapting well to incarceration without causing problems. The defense brought in expert witnesses who testified about Brad's childhood trauma and how it affected brain development, his long history of drug abuse, and how substances impaired judgment, and his ability to function in a structured prison environment. 5 family members painted a picture of a man who struggled with mental illness and addiction, but who also showed love and responsibility toward his family. Defense attorney Frank Epps acknowledged that Brad's actions were terrible and inexcusable, but argued he was not a monster. He was a human being who snapped under the pressure of mental illness, drug addiction, and a toxic relationship. Epps described Brad as a lovesick man who made a terrible mistake but shouldn't be killed for it. He urged the jury to consider Brad's mental health issues, drug problems, and traumatic childhood, pointing out that Brad had immediately expressed remorse and admitted his guilt from the start. Finally, Brad himself spoke to the jury. He admitted he was obsessed with Rebecca and loved her more than anything in the world. He acknowledged hating what he did and said he probably deserved to die. But he didn't want to die, because it would devastate his mother, brothers, and sisters. He wanted to live for his family's sake. After Brad sat down, the courtroom fell silent. The defense had done everything they could, and now the jury held Brad's life in their hand. The jury deliberated for several hours. They had to weigh the aggravating factors against the mitigating factors and decide which outweighed the other. It was a heavy responsibility, and they took it seriously. Under South Carolina law, the jury had to unanimously agree on the sentence. If even one juror voted for life in prison, that would be the sentence. But if all 12 jurors agreed that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating factors, Brad Sigmon would be sentenced to death. The jury reviewed the evidence presented during the sentencing phase. They discussed Brad's difficult childhood and his mental health issues. They considered his drug addiction and the testimony about his behavior in jail. These were real mitigating factors that deserved consideration, but they also reviewed the crime scene photos. They thought about the fact that Brad had not just killed one person in a moment of rage, he had systematically beaten 2 elderly people to death and then kidnapped and shot their daughter. On July 20, 2002, the jury returned to the courtroom with their decision. Brad stood as the foreman read the verdict. For the murder of David Lark, death. For the murder of Gladys Lark, death. For the burglary charge, 30 years in prison. Brad showed little reaction. He had expected this outcome. His attorneys placed reassuring hands on his shoulders as the judge formally imposed the sentences. The Lark family members present in the courtroom felt a mix of emotions. Justice had been served in the sense that Brad would pay the ultimate price for his crimes. But no verdict could bring David and Gladys back. No sentence could undo the trauma that Rebecca and her children had experienced. Rebecca Barbar did not attend the sentencing. She had said what she needed to say during her testimony and had chosen not to be present for this final chapter of the trial. She was trying to focus on healing and moving forward with her life. Brad Sigmon was officially moved to South Carolina's death row. He would spend the next 2 decades fighting his sentence through appeals while living in a small cell, isolated from the general prison population. Death row at South Carolina's Broad River Correctional Institution was a place designed to break the human spirit. Inmates lived in small cells, isolated from general population and from each other for most of each day. They had limited recreation time, restricted contact with the outside world, and the constant knowledge that the state intended to kill them. When Brad Sigmon arrived on death row in 2002, he was a broken man. The first years were the hardest. Brad struggled with depression and guilt. The drugs and alcohol that had helped him numb his pain for so many years were no longer available. He had to face what he had done while completely sober, and the weight of it was crushing. The death row unit was initially housed at Liber Correctional Institution in rural Dorchester County. Brad was surrounded by other men who had committed terrible crimes. Some maintained their innocence. Others, like Brad, had admitted their guilt. All of them lived with the knowledge that the state planned to kill them. Larry Tyree, a volunteer chaplain with the South Carolina Department of Corrections, met Brad during this period. Tyree would later describe Brad as a bitter man in those early years. Brad was angry at himself, angry at the world, angry at the situation he found himself in. But something began to change in Brad over time. He started attending religious services offered to death row inmates. He began reading the Bible. At first, it was simply a way to pass time, but gradually, the words began to mean something to him. Brad had grown up with some exposure to Christianity, but it had never been central to his life. Now, facing death and living with immense guilt, he found himself drawn to the message of redemption and forgiveness that Christianity offered. He began to pray regularly. The transformation was slow. It took years, not months. But people around Brad began to notice changes. He became less angry. He started engaging positively with guards and other inmates. He participated in Bible studies and eventually began leading them himself. In 2020, Brad met Reverend Hillary Taylor, a United Methodist pastor and the executive director of South Carolinians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. She began serving as Brad's spiritual advisor. They initially communicated through letters, then progressed to phone calls. Reverend Taylor was struck by how deeply Brad had internalized his faith. She later said that he understood the Bible better than most pastors she knew. He had spent hours studying Scripture and reflecting on what it meant for his life. Brad was particularly drawn to the story of King David from the Old Testament. David had been a shepherd boy who became a great king, but he had also committed terrible sins, including arranging for a man to be killed so he could take the man's wife. Despite these crimes, David had been described as a man after God's own heart because of his genuine repentance. Brad saw parallels in his own story. Brad expressed remorse every single day of his incarceration. He never tried to minimize what he had done or shift blame to others. He acknowledged that he deserved to die for his crimes, but he hoped to live so he could continue to grow spiritually and help others. By the time the 2020s arrived, Brad had spent nearly 2 decades on death row. The death row unit had been moved from Liba to a renovated facility at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia. Brad was now in his 60s and in declining health. He had suffered at least 1 stroke and had nearly complete blockage of his carotid arteries, putting him at high risk for another stroke. But despite his physical decline, Brad's spirit remained strong. His faith sustained him. He accepted that he might be executed, but he hoped he might be allowed to continue living and serving as a witness to God's redemptive power. But the question remained: did his transformation matter to the legal system? Could it save his life? South Carolina had not executed anyone since 2011. For 13 years, the state's death row had been in a holding pattern. The reason was simple. Pharmaceutical companies had stopped selling the drugs needed for lethal injection to states that used them for executions. The companies did not want their products associated with capital punishment. They began implementing strict controls to prevent their drugs from being diverted to execution purposes. South Carolina found itself unable to obtain pentobarbital or other drugs used in its lethal injection protocol. Without the drugs, executions stopped. Death row inmates had their execution dates cancelled. Some people hoped this meant South Carolina was moving away from capital punishment. The number of people on death row declined as some inmates died of natural causes and others had their sentences reduced through successful appeals. By the early 2020s, fewer than 30 people remained on death row, down from more than 60 before the moratorium. But in 2021, the South Carolina legislature took action to restart executions. They passed a law that made several significant changes. First, the law reintroduced the electric chair as an execution method. South Carolina had an electric chair nicknamed Old Sparky that was 113 years old. The law made the electric chair the default execution method if an inmate did not choose an alternative. Second, the law introduced firing squads as an execution option for the first time in South Carolina's modern history. Inmates could choose between lethal injection, electric chair, or firing squad. If they refused to choose, they would be executed by electric chair. Third, the law included a shield provision that made information about execution procedures secret. The state was not required to disclose where it obtained lethal injection drugs, who served on execution teams, or details about protocols. Death row inmates, including Brad Sigmon, immediately challenged the new law. They filed lawsuits arguing that both the electric chair and firing squad constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the South Carolina Constitution. A trial court held extensive hearings on the matter and initially issued an injunction blocking the use of these methods. But the state appealed, and on July 31, 2024, the South Carolina Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that both methods were constitutional. The ruling paved the way for executions to resume. The court authorized the state to carry out 6 executions over the next year, spaced 5 weeks apart. Brad Sigmon was 4th on the list. Ahead of him were Freddie Eugene Owens, Richard Bernard Moore, and Marion Bowman Jr. In September 2024, South Carolina executed Freddie Owens by lethal injection. It was the state's first execution in 13 years. Witnesses reported that Owens appeared to stop breathing within minutes of the drug being administered, but he was not pronounced dead for 20 minutes. The length of time raised questions about whether the execution protocol was working as intended. In November 2024, Richard Moore was executed, also by lethal injection. Media witnesses again noted that Moore was not pronounced dead for more than 20 minutes. An autopsy later revealed disturbing findings. Moore's lungs were massively swollen with blood and fluid, a condition called pulmonary edema. Experts said this would have felt like drowning. The autopsy also revealed that Moore had been given 2 doses of pentobarbital, not 1 as the protocol called for. In January 2025, Marion Bowman Jr. became the 3rd person executed. Once again, witnesses noted the prolonged time between drug administration and death pronouncement. An autopsy showed fluid in Bowman's lungs as well. These 3 executions alarmed defense attorneys representing other death row inmates, including Brad Sigmon. The autopsy findings suggested that South Carolina's lethal injection protocol was causing suffering. Inmates might be drowning in their own fluids while paralyzed and unable to indicate their distress. On February 7, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued Brad Sigmon's death warrant. His execution was scheduled for March 7, 2025. He had until February 21st to choose his method of execution: lethal injection, electric chair, or firing squad. Brad faced an impossible choice. Each method carried risks and unknowns. The electric chair was violent and had a history of botched executions. Brad feared being burned alive as electricity coursed through his body. Lethal injection was shrouded in secrecy. Brad's attorneys had tried to get information about the drugs, their expiration dates, storage conditions, potency tests, but the state refused to provide this information under the SHIELD law. The recent autopsies suggested lethal injection might cause prolonged suffering. The firing squad was untested in South Carolina. It would be violent and traumatic for witnesses, but it would likely be quick. Brad struggled with the decision. His attorneys advised him, but ultimately the choice was his alone. Brad Sigmon's decision to choose the firing squad reverberated through the media and the criminal justice system. It would be the first firing squad execution in South Carolina's modern history, and the first in the United States since 2010, when Utah executed Ronnie Lee Gardner. Gerald Bo King, Brad's attorney from the Federal Public Defender's Office, released a statement explaining the reasoning behind Brad's choice. "The choice Brad faced today was impossible," King said. "Unless he elected lethal injection or the firing squad, he would die in South Carolina's ancient electric chair, which would burn and cook him alive. But the alternative is just as monstrous. If he chose lethal injection, he risked the prolonged death suffered by all 3 of the men South Carolina has executed since September, 3 men Brad knew and cared for, who remained alive, strapped to a gurney, for more than 20 minutes. After making his choice, Brad's legal team continued fighting for his life through appeals. On February 21st, the same day he chose the firing squad, they filed a petition asking the South Carolina Supreme Court to hear evidence about Brad's mental illness, brain damage, and childhood trauma. The petition argued that Brad's trial attorneys in 2002 had failed to adequately investigate and present this evidence. John Abdallah and Frank Epes, who had no death penalty experience, had presented some mitigating evidence, but they had not fully explored Brad's mental health history. The petition revealed new information. In 2021, while on death row, Brad had been formally diagnosed with bipolar disorder type 2. This was an inherited mental illness that Brad's family had a history of, but that had never been properly diagnosed or treated in Brad's case. On March 4, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court unanimously denied the petition. The court found that Brad's trial attorneys had presented some evidence of mental health issues and drug abuse during the sentencing phase. While they may not have presented all the evidence that was available, the court determined this did not constitute ineffective assistance of counsel. On the morning of March 7, 2025, Brad Sigmund woke in his cell on death row, knowing it would be his last day alive. He had spent 23 years in this place, but today was different. Today, the state of South Carolina would kill him. Brad had been moved to a cell near the execution chamber. Security around him had increased in the days leading up to the execution. Guards monitored him closely to ensure he did not attempt to harm himself. The state wanted Brad alive for his execution. At 9 in the morning, Reverend Hilary Taylor and another spiritual advisor arrived for their final visit with Brad. They were given 2 hours, from 9 until 11 in the morning. They sat with Brad in a small room and talked about faith, family, and what came next. Brad was surprisingly calm. He had accepted his fate. He knew he deserved to die for what he had done to David and Gladys Lark. His faith told him that God had forgiven him, and that brought him peace. But he was still afraid of the physical act of dying. The conversation focused on the people Brad loved. He talked about his siblings, his son Robbie, and the friends he had made on death row. He expressed hope that his death might somehow contribute to ending the death penalty in South Carolina. He wanted his final statement to reflect his Christian faith and his belief that executing people was wrong. At 11, the spiritual advisors had to leave. Brad was given time alone to pray and prepare himself mentally for what was coming. In the early afternoon, Brad was offered a final meal. Days earlier, he had requested 3 buckets of original recipe Kentucky Fried Chicken so he could share his last meal with other death row inmates. But prison protocol required all food to come from the prison kitchen, and this request was denied. Instead, Brad was given an individual meal: 4 pieces of fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. He ate some of it but had little appetite. Outside the prison, protesters were gathering. About 30 people stood along the fence, holding signs that read, "All life is precious, and no more killing." They prayed and sang hymns. Randy Gardner was there, holding an urn containing his brother Ronnie's ashes. Inside the prison, final preparations were underway in the death chamber. The firing squad chair had been positioned in the corner of the room. 3 volunteer members of the correction staff had been selected to serve as shooters. They were positioned behind a wall with a rectangular opening, 15 feet from where Brad would sit. Each volunteer had been given a rifle loaded with .308 caliber Winchester ammunition. The bullets were designed to shatter on impact, causing maximum damage to the heart. All 3 rifles contained live ammunition. There were no blanks. At 6 in the evening, guards came to Brad's cell. It was time. They placed him in restraints and walked him down the hallway to the execution chamber. Brad walked calmly, without resistance. The death chamber was a small room that also housed South Carolina's electric chair. The lethal injection gurney had been rolled away. Brad's chair sat in the corner, facing the wall where the shooters waited behind the opening. Guards secured Brad to the chair. Straps went around his head, chest, arms, and ankles. He could not move. A member of the execution team placed a white circular target with a red bullseye over Brad's heart. In the witness room, about a dozen people watched through bullet-resistant glass. 3 members of the Lark family were present, including Rebecca's son Ricky Sims. Representatives from the prosecutor's office and sheriff's office attended. Gerald "Bo" King, Brad's attorney, was there, along with Reverend Taylor. 3 media representatives completed the witness group. Brad looked toward his attorney. He tried to communicate non-verbally that he was okay. Then a black hood was placed over his head, blocking his vision. At 6:01, the curtain between the witness room and the execution chamber opened. Witnesses could now see Brad strapped to the chair, the target visible on his chest, the hood covering his face. Gerald King stood and read Brad's final statement aloud. Gerald "Bo" King's voice was steady but emotional as he read the statement Brad Sigmund had prepared for this moment. "I want my closing statement to be one of love and a calling to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty." King read, "An eye for an eye was used as justification to the jury for seeking the death penalty. At that time, I was too ignorant to know how wrong that was. Why? Because we no longer live under the Old Testament law, but now live under the New Testament. King continued reading as witnesses listened intently. Some of the Larker family members looked away. Media witnesses took notes. Matthew 5:38-39 says, "You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that you do not resist an evil person. Whosoever shall smite me on the right cheek, turn to him the other one as well." Romans 6:14 says, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are no longer under the law but under grace." Nowhere does God in the New Testament give man the authority to kill another man. That is why the Bible is divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament. Remember the words of Jesus, John 7:19, "Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keep with the law. We are now under God's grace and mercy." King finished reading and sat down. The room was completely silent. Behind the wall, a black shade was pulled aside, revealing the opening where the 3 shooters stood. Witnesses could not see the shooters, only the rectangular opening. Brad sat motionless in the chair. Under the hood, he was praying. He was ready. At 6:05, without warning or countdown, 3 rifle shots rang out simultaneously. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Several witnesses jumped at the sudden crack of gunfire. The white target on Brad's chest disappeared instantly, blasted away by the impact of 3 bullets striking within inches of each other. A jagged red stain, about the size of a small fist, appeared where the target had been. Brad's entire body flinched from the impact. His chest rose and fell rapidly 2 or 3 times. His arms tensed briefly against the restraints. Blood began spreading across his black jumpsuit. Then the movement stopped. Brad's chest no longer rose. There was no sound from him, no cry of pain, no gasp for breath. Outside of the rifle crack, the room had been completely silent. Witnesses stared at the scene before them. Some looked away. Others continued watching, documenting what they were seeing for the reports they would write later. Jeffrey Collins from the Associated Press had covered many executions in his career. He would later write about how his heart had started pounding after the final statement was read, how the rifle crack had startled him despite knowing it was coming, how the target had disappeared instantly. At 6:06, approximately 1 minute after the shots were fired, a doctor entered the death chamber. He walked to Brad's body and placed a stethoscope against his chest, listening for a heartbeat. He listened for about 90 seconds. Checking thoroughly. At 6:08, the doctor stepped back and nodded to the warden. The warden announced that Brad Keith Sigmon had been pronounced dead. The execution was over. It had taken 3 minutes from the moment the shots were fired to the official pronouncement of death. This was dramatically faster than the 20-plus minutes it had taken for the recent lethal injection executions. The curtain closed, blocking the witness's view of Brad's body. Prison staff would now begin the process of removing Brad from the chair and transferring his body to the medical examiner. As night fell on March 7, 2025, Brad Sigmon's body was transported from the prison in a hearse. The protesters slowly dispersed. Media crews packed up their equipment. The execution was over. Brad Keith Sigmon, age 67, had become the first person executed by firing squad in South Carolina and the first in the United States in 15 years. If you found this documentary informative and thought-provoking, please subscribe to No Way Out. We bring you in-depth, well-researched documentaries on capital punishment cases that explore the complexities of crime, justice, and the human condition. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Each documentary represents hours of research, fact-checking, and careful storytelling to bring you cases that matter.